acracia. I might not be aware of my desires. That's why I put it even below the line, like this world. And then you might think of this as a subconscious, unconscious state, right? A state where I'm not necessarily cognitively always aware of that which I actually desire, but my desires inform my values. Thus, I can look at what an individual values and make sense of what the desires the individual has, because it's the desire that's motivating the value. This system of value, this ethical system, right, if you're following along now, and I know I'm going faster in this section, and I know it's a little bit deeper, but follow along, right? So the idea is, this system of values, then, is what's going to direct me towards a state of perfection, but there's only so far as I can get in this world, because this world, my physical, biological form ends in death, right? The end, really, in this world, and I recognize this, is death. It ends in death, right? So we have our book, as I said in the last lecture. And my page as an atheist, hypothetically speaking, ends here. But I'm able to flip the page over, and there's this afterlife story, right? Right, there's this after story. The afterlife story is a recognition that in this life, in this world, my values culminate in my behavior. Then we can break this down even more, right? Culminates in how I live my life, how I behave, how I act, what I believe in, you know, my relationship with other human beings, blah, 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 blah. That's going to guide the way that I live. I die. Once I die, then, the next story starts. And the story is a story of sort of like looking at your, and I'm not trying to make fun of this, but and this is sort of trite, but it's like looking at your resume for your life. Well, what did you do? Were you a good person? Did you follow the rules? Did you believe what you ought to believe? Did you follow what the system of beliefs that was set in place to guide your values and thus your behavior? Did you follow that system of beliefs? Yes? Okay, good. If it's yes, right, then you reach the ultimate level of perfection, right? So this is like perfection with a minor p, which is just like living a value-filled life. Of course, that value has to be in accordance with the system of beliefs that regulates that value. Then, if you've accomplished all that, then you truly reach the ultimate state of perfection, which is personal immortality, right? You reach that state of personal immortality. And that's the ultimate drive, right? This personal state of immortality, however, is it's obviously the case, right? It's not epistemologically accessible. It's epistemologically inaccessible. C-E-S. Right? It's not epistemologically accessible. It's epistemologically inaccessible. We can't cognitively get to a state of affairs where we can understand, where we can make sense of what that might look like. What might personal immortality in an afterlife look like? The only way then, obviously, to make this transition, and this is the culmination of everything, the only way then to make that transition is through faith. You might not be able to read it, but faith, right? Faith is a system in place. Faith is the ability in place which allows the devotee, obviously, to enter that state of perfection. What Nietzsche says then is the demand of the ideal state is that man should castrate himself from those instincts with which he can be an enemy. Obviously, that reference doesn't speak to transcendence, right? There is no enemy status in transcendence. There is no combat status in a transcendent realm. Why? As I said before, because of the ideological assumptions that all devotees and believers must have assumed in this world, right? Can cause harm, can cause anger, can cause him to demand revenge. All of that means that the values that I must ascribe in this world must make me, must take away any threat that I have to the other, right? Obviously, this doesn't apply to the way that we conduct ourselves in a transcendent realm. This applies to the way that we conduct ourselves in this realm. And what Nietzsche is saying is, in order to reach that ideal state, you have to be the weakest person in this state, in this world, right? You can't have any power at all. You have to be devoid of power, right? Such that the way in which you achieve a state of personal immortality, personal transcendence in the other world is by absolutely devaluing, right? devaluing the notion of power in this world. And that's the key, right? It is the ultimate attempt to devalue notions of power in this world that grant you access to the other world, because you will have lived a life in which you were no threat to any human being, though we see how that culminates, right, in various religious traditions, right? The Messianic figure usually lives a very difficult life. Number two, man should deliberately, well, obviously this is what I'm saying now, right? So number two is, bottom of page 61, man should deliberately weaken himself by disassociating himself with anything that may inflict harm on others, right? You can't put yourself in a position where your ideas can inflict harm, where your actions physically can inflict harm, where anything that you do can inflict harm. And basically those are the two things that inflict harm. The mind as manifest in many different ways, or the body as manifest in physical combat. Right? You have to make sure that you don't live a life where power is the driving desire. Power can't be a desire here. It can't be. Right? What's interesting to note about this is that Nietzsche's system is completely antithetical to this system. I haven't really gotten into it yet. Not me. Nietzsche hasn't really gotten into it. He's given us some glimpses. You know, there's a lot there. But we haven't had the final narrative, and we won't really get an introduction to the final narrative until the next book, book 3. We start to get it. Obviously, book 4 is the culmination. We see the whole grand narrative. But Nietzsche's system is a system that's going to transform values, right? We recognize the association between desires and values. This system, this ideological belief, says that you shouldn't have the desire for power. Why? Because the desire for power manifests in the ability to do harm to others, right? I'm not in the military. I don't have swords and knives and guns. I'm not going to sit down and street fight with some dude on the street. But hey, Dr. Campbell, your mind is something which can be used as a weapon. You can weaponize your mind, right? You can mess with people's minds. You can mess with people's lives, right? Nietzsche says that according to this system, just the possibility that I have that is a consequence of power, is a consequence of desire, and I need to relinquish that so that I am no threat at all. And his system is just the opposite. His system is not a system, and this is where people confuse Nietzsche. Nietzsche is not saying that you should have the desire for power and thus assume values that will lead you to become more powerful in order to be a better warrior, in order to be more belligerent in society. He's not saying that at all. Right? That's completely false. That's categorically false. What he is saying, however, actually I don't want to jump ahead. So he's not saying that. He's not saying that at all. I haven't given enough of the material, and it would be jumping way ahead to talk about exactly what he is saying. So I think that's clear. And then lastly, on the bottom of page 61, the duality of good and evil assumes mutually exclusive characteristics. Right? The value of good and evil assumes mutually exclusive characteristics. Good acts are all positive and condoned. Evil acts are all negative and condemned. Right? Good acts are moral acts and acceptable. Evil acts are immoral and unacceptable. Right? There isn't a state of affairs in which you can say that the act is moral or just if it doesn't conform to the law. The law says you are to perform yourself, you are to conduct yourself in action X, and you don't have an opportunity to do other than action X, right? Because we have to live our lives under this ideological system of beliefs in accordance with the law. Okay, so that's number 3 at the bottom of page 61. Number 4, and this is very, very important. Right? Number 4, this is key. Here's a quote from Nietzsche, and I'm going to take my time and explain this. Number 4, top of page 62. Quote, at its peak, it imagines the state in which all that is evil is annulled. When we reach the state of perfection, right? When we reach the state of perfection, imagine that it's a hierarchical state and we're moving up towards it, right? Through various levels. This is just conceptually. As